Your dinner is rising through the floor. Not from a cart in the aisle, from a kitchen you didn't know existed. A windowless galley, hidden beneath the passenger deck of a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, where flight attendants load meal carts onto small mechanical lifts and send them up through shafts built into the fuselage. Upstairs, the cabin is hushed. The carpet runs 19 feet, wall to wall. The aisles are empty. 7 stereo channels hum through pneumatic headphones, and not a single passenger looks down. For a handful of years in the 1970s, airlines buried a full working kitchen beneath the floor of a jetliner and spent a fortune keeping it hidden. This is the story of why they built it and why they stopped. You're walking down the jetway now. It's 1973. The tunnel slopes gently downward, and at the end of it, you can already see the door, wider than you expected, framed in polished metal, standing open like the entrance to somewhere that matters. A flight attendant greets you with a nod and a smile. You step across the threshold, and something changes. The cabin doesn't feel like an airplane. It's the first thing that strikes you, and the thing you'll remember longest, not the seats, not the overhead bins or the safety card tucked into the pocket ahead of you, the space, the sheer, generous, almost improbable amount of space stretching away from you in every direction. The ceiling rises 8 feet and 8 inches above the floor, high enough that even a tall man wouldn't think about ducking. And the cabin stretches nearly 19 feet from wall to wall, carpeted edge to edge in a single unbroken sweep of fabric that runs the full width of the aircraft without a seam. 2 wide aisles extend down the length of the fuselage, and between them, the seats are arranged in neat, generous rows with room to spare on every side. You can stand in your row and stretch your arms without brushing the passenger beside you. You can walk to the lavatory without turning sideways, without catching your hip on an armrest, without the awkward little shuffle that flying so often requires. You can move, you can breathe, and it's quiet. That's the second thing you notice. And it's strange enough to make you pause. 3 Rolls-Royce engines are pushing this aircraft through the sky. Each one produces roughly 42,000 pounds of thrust. 3 columns of controlled fire, burning kerosene at a ferocious rate, propelling 200 tons of aluminum and human beings through the upper atmosphere at 550 miles an hour, 42,000 feet above the earth. And inside the cabin, you'd barely know any of it was happening. The sound is there, a low, constant hum, almost like a note held on a cello, present but not intrusive, felt as much as heard, but the roar you might expect from a jet engine, the high-pitched whine that drills into your skull on other aircraft, has been swallowed, muffled, engineered away. Lockheed packed the fuselage walls with layers of acoustic insulation, and Rolls-Royce designed the RB-211 turbofan to run smoother and quieter than any comparable engine in the widebody class. The high bypass design pushed more air around the engine core than through it, and that meant less scream, less vibration, less of the raw mechanical aggression that passengers on earlier jets had learned to tolerate. Eastern Airlines, the first carrier to fly this airplane, called it the Whisperliner. That wasn't a word dreamed up by an advertising agency hoping to paper over a noisy cabin. Eastern's own marketing leaned hard on the promise of quiet because the airplane actually delivered it. You could hold a conversation in a normal voice. You could read without earplugs. You could fall asleep without the engines reminding you every few seconds that you were strapped inside a machine hurtling through thin air at the edge of the stratosphere. The Whisperliner. That was what it felt like to sit in one. Now settle into your seat. Run your hand along the armrest, solid, wide, upholstered in fabric that feels considered rather than cheap. There's weight to the tray table when you fold it down, a satisfying mechanical click when it locks into place. Pick up the pneumatic headphones from the seat pocket. They're an odd contraption if you haven't seen them before. Hollow plastic tubes connected to a small junction at the armrest, carrying sound to your ears through nothing but air pressure and acoustic resonance. No wires, no electronics, just physics. Dial through 7 stereo channels until you find something that suits your mood. There's orchestral music for the passenger who wants to think, jazz for the one who wants to drift. Easy listening for those who just want the world to hum along pleasantly while they watch the clouds turn gold outside the window. And the light in here is warm. Not the harsh fluorescent wash of a hospital ceiling or a late-night office, but something softer, more intentional. Lockheed thought about this. They studied what it would feel like to spend 4 or 5 hours inside this cabin, and they designed the lighting to make you want to settle in rather than count the minutes until arrival. The glow falls evenly without glare, and it makes the carpet and the upholstery and the faces of the passengers around you look just slightly better than they would under ordinary light. It's a small thing, but small things, accumulated carefully, are what make a space feel like somewhere instead of nowhere. And then a flight attendant appears, not pushing a cart, not squeezing past your knees with a heavy, clanking trolley blocking the aisle while you flatten yourself against the window and try to make your legs disappear. She just appears at your row with your meal. Hot on tray, cold salad, a bread roll still warm from the oven, a pat of butter on a small china plate, everything at precisely the right temperature, presented as if it had materialized from thin air. But it hadn't come from thin air at all. It had come from beneath your feet. Because this airplane, the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, had a secret. A full working galley, hidden below the passenger deck, connected to the cabin above by 2 small lifts that carried food and service carts up through the floor. A kitchen underneath a living room. And for a handful of years in the 1970s, airlines flew it this way on purpose. They chose the arrangement. They paid for it. They believed in it with the earnestness of people who genuinely thought that the way a cabin felt mattered as much as where the airplane went. The question is, why would anyone go to that kind of trouble? Why build a hidden kitchen inside a jetliner, and why did they stop? We bring back the days when the journey meant just as much as the destination. The ships, the trains, the stories worth remembering. If you'd like to come along for the ride, subscribe. We've got more of these waiting for you. Now, let's continue. To understand why the TriStar was built this way, why Lockheed buried a kitchen beneath the passenger deck of a commercial airliner, you have to understand the moment it was born into. And that moment was unlike anything the aviation industry had seen before or has seen since. The late 1960s were intoxicating. The jet age was barely a decade old. Propeller airliners were fading from the major routes. And the world's airlines were about to take the biggest leap in commercial aviation since the Wright brothers left the ground. The wide-body era was coming. Aircraft with 2 aisles instead of 1. Cabins wide enough to seat 8, 9, even 10 people in a single row. Cargo holds big enough to swallow standardized freight containers by the dozen. Airplanes so large that the older narrow bodies, the 707s, the DC-8s, the Convairs, would look like toys parked beside them on the ramp. Boeing fired the starting gun with the 747. That enormous, audacious, hump-backed gamble, 4 engines, a double-deck nose, a cabin that could hold 400 passengers or more, was the airplane that would redefine long-haul travel forever. But the 747 was a giant, designed for the thickest international routes, New York to London, Los Angeles to Tokyo, the great transoceanic corridors, where you could fill a 400-seat airplane and make it pay. What the airlines also needed was something slightly smaller. A wide body for the domestic trunk routes, New York to Los Angeles, Chicago to Miami, Atlanta to Dallas, Boston to San Francisco, where passenger demand was strong, but not 747 strong. An airplane with wide-body comfort and wide-body presence, but sized for markets that would fill 250 seats, not 400. 2 companies stepped forward to build that airplane. McDonnell Douglas, based in Long Beach, California, offered the DC-10, a three-engine widebody with a straightforward design and a competitive price. And Lockheed, just up the coast in Burbank, offered the L-1011 TriStar. Lockheed was the more interesting bet and the riskier one. The company hadn't built a commercial airliner in years. Their last attempt, the L-188 Electra, had been a turboprop that entered service in 1959 with high expectations and ran straight into disaster. Two fatal crashes, one in Indiana, one in Texas, were eventually traced to a structural flaw that allowed the engine nacelles to flex catastrophically under certain conditions. The Electra was grounded, redesigned, and eventually became one of the most reliable propeller aircraft of its generation, but the damage was done. Airlines cancelled orders. Passengers avoided the type. Lockheed retreated from the commercial market entirely and spent the next decade focused on military work. The C-130 Hercules, the C-141 Starlifter, the SR-71 Blackbird, the classified projects that kept the company alive, but far from the airlines. When the wide-body era opened up in the late 60s, Lockheed saw a chance to come back. And they didn't come back cautiously. They came back swinging. The L-1011 wouldn't just be a big airplane with a wide cabin. It would be the most refined, most technically sophisticated, most passenger-centered commercial aircraft anyone had ever built. The TriStar first flew in November of 1970. It won its FAA type certificate on April 14, 1972, and that same month, Eastern Airlines inaugurated revenue service. 3 engines, 2 hung beneath the wings in conventional pods, and 1 mounted in the tail, fed through a graceful S-shaped intake duct that gave the TriStar its distinctive rear silhouette. A wide, twin-aisle cabin that typically seated around 250 passengers in a mixed configuration of first class and coach. Fly-by-wire technology on some control surfaces, a feature years ahead of its time. An auto-land system capable of bringing the airplane down safely in near-zero visibility. And a price tag that, even by 1973 standards, gave airline treasurers pause, around $18 million per aircraft. Run that number through the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation calculator, and you arrive at something in the neighborhood of $130 million today, per airplane. That was the cost of the dream. And part of what those millions bought was the quiet. 3RB 211 engines, humming away behind walls of insulation, while the cabin sat in its pool of engineered calm. But a larger part, the part most passengers never learned about, was what lay beneath them. Let's go downstairs, not through a passenger entrance. There isn't one. Passengers were never meant to see this space, never meant to know it existed in the way you'd know a kitchen exists in a restaurant, only because you see waiters coming and going through a swinging door. On the TriStar, there was no swinging door, no visible threshold. The lower galley was reached by crew through a narrow internal stairway, or, more commonly during service, by riding down in one of 2 small service lifts, each just large enough to hold a single standard airline meal cart. These lifts are the key to the entire arrangement. 2 vertical shafts built into the structure of the fuselage, connecting the hidden kitchen below to the passenger cabin above. When a cart goes up, the food arrives. When the lift comes back down empty, the next cart is waiting. The lifts are the magic trick. They are the reason your aisle stays clear, your cabin stays composed, and your dinner appears as if delivered by some quiet, invisible hand. Step off the lift, and the world changes. There are no windows down here. That's the first thing you feel. Not see, feel. The absence of natural light, the sense of enclosure, the awareness that you are now inside the belly of the airplane, below the floor that 250 passengers are sitting on, in a space designed not for their experience, but for the work that makes their experience possible. The ceiling is lower. You feel it immediately, a compression of vertical space that reminds you this room was carved out of structure, not designed as a destination. The lighting is functional, bright even without warmth. The kind of illumination you'd find in any commercial kitchen. Clear enough to read labels by, strong enough to check tray contents at speed, and utterly without charm. This is not a space that cares how you feel. This is a space that cares whether the meals are correct. The air is different too, warmer than the cabin above. You can feel the ovens even before you see them. A dry, radiant heat that presses gently against exposed skin and builds as the service progresses. There's a metallic quality to the smell down here. Stainless steel, hot aluminum, the faintly chemical tang of warmed foil packaging. And underneath that, the actual food. Bread rolls heating, entrees restoring, coffee percolating in quantities meant for 250 people. The galley smells like work. Meal carts line the walls in precise rows, each one loaded in a specific sequence. There are warming compartments for hot entrees, cooling sections for salads and desserts, storage drawers for service items, napkins, cutlery packets, sugar and cream, and prep surfaces arranged so that 2 or 3 flight attendants can work in coordinated, practiced motion without colliding. The space is tight, but it's efficient. Every surface serves a purpose. Every drawer has a function. Lockheed's engineers designed this galley with the same attention to workflow that they brought to cockpit ergonomics. Nothing wasted, nothing misplaced. Everything within arm's reach of where it needs to be. Can you picture the contrast? Upstairs, 250 passengers sit in their carpeted, sound-dampened living room, listening to stereo through pneumatic headphones, sipping drinks in wide seats, gazing out windows at a sky that stretches to the curve of the earth. They are unaware that any kitchen exists, and directly below them, separated by nothing more than the thickness of the cabin floor, a few inches of insulation and structural aluminum, a team of flight attendants is assembling meals at speed, sliding trays into ovens, checking temperatures, loading carts in sequence, first class first, then forward coach, then rear coach, timing the lifts so that each cart arrives above at exactly the right moment, sending load after load up through the floor on small mechanical elevators, each one emerging into the cabin like a delivery from a world the passengers will never visit. Lockheed's design philosophy, as later described from company material, was elegant in its simplicity. Take the kitchen out of the living room. That phrase tells you everything. They weren't merely designing a galley system, they were designing an absence. The absence of clutter, noise, food smells, and visible labour in the passenger cabin. If the kitchen could be hidden completely, the living room could finally feel like one. No bulky carts parked in the aisle, no flight attendants wrestling ovens 3 feet from your elbow, no smell of reheated chicken drifting through the cabin while you're trying to read. Just calm, just space, just the impression that your meal arrived from somewhere serene rather than somewhere industrial. And the airlines that flew the TriStar embraced this idea with genuine enthusiasm. TWA was perhaps the most creative operator when it came to exploiting the hidden galley's possibilities, and their approach tells you a great deal about what airlines believed air travel could be in the early 1970s. In first class, TWA installed swiveling centre seats, chairs that passengers could physically rotate to face one another, creating intimate dining groups of 4. Imagine it, you and 3 companions seated around a space that feels more like a corner table in a fine restaurant than a row of airline seats. Fold-out meal tables extended from the armrests, providing a stable surface for proper place settings. The lighting was subdued, the service was unhurried, almost theatrical. Each course presented with deliberation, the attendant moving between these small dining clusters as a waiter might move between tables in a good hotel restaurant. And the food arrived from below. Entrees were loaded into the lower galley before departure. stored in refrigerated compartments during the boarding and climb-out phases of flight, then transferred to ovens for restoration at precisely the right moment, timed so that first-class meals would be ready before the coach service began. When the moment came, a flight attendant downstairs loaded a finished cart onto the lift, pressed the button, and sent it up. A colleague on the main deck received the cart at a satellite service point, a small staging area positioned near the lift opening, designed to minimize the distance between the elevator and the first passenger who'd receive a tray. The goal was elegance through invisibility. Keep the heavy carts out of the aisles. Keep the food preparation out of sight. Keep the cabin feeling open and composed, even during the busiest part of the flight. TWA's coach passengers were meant to experience the same sense of spaciousness as those in front. 2 wide aisles, no obstructions, a cabin that flowed rather than clogged. The airplane's own architecture did the work that no amount of crew training could accomplish. It physically removed the machinery of meal service from the space where passengers sat. Delta Airlines, which would eventually become the TriStar's single largest operator, took a slightly different approach to cabin service, but shared the same fundamental instinct. Their 1973 brochure, a gorgeous full-colour production that reads less like an advertisement and more like an invitation to a private club, sold the TriStar as something categorically different from ordinary air travel. The language is worth savouring. Wall-to-wall carpeting, nearly 19 feet across. That 8-foot 8-inch ceiling, designed to make the cabin feel like a room rather than a tube. 10 flight attendants and 3 pilots. A crew of 13 for roughly 250 passengers, a ratio that allowed for the kind of attentive, personalised service you might associate with an ocean liner or a grand hotel. Delta called their TriStar cabins the living rooms that fly, and they printed that phrase in their brochure without a trace of irony or qualification, because that was exactly what the experience delivered. There's a detail in that brochure that's easy to read past, but worth pausing on. Delta didn't simply promise good food. They promised food that arrived hot when it should be hot, and cold when it should be cold. Read that again. It sounds so unremarkable. Of course, food should arrive at the right temperature, shouldn't it? But think about what that claim actually requires at 35,000 feet, in an aluminum tube pressurized to the equivalent of 6,000 feet, with 250 mouths to feed simultaneously, meals prepared on the ground hours earlier and stored in the belly of the aircraft during the flight. It requires a kitchen, a real one, with ovens that heat evenly, refrigeration that holds temperature, enough prep space to stage and manage hundreds of individual meal trays without mixing up the special orders, the kosher meals, the children's plates, the first-class presentations. And it requires that kitchen to be close enough to serve the cabin quickly. A hot entree cools fast at altitude, but far enough removed that passengers never hear the clatter of trays being loaded, never smell the industrial warmth of a bank of ovens working at full capacity, never feel the subtle shudder of a lift mechanism cycling beneath their feet. The lower galley solved every one of those problems at once, neatly, cleverly, even in its way, beautifully, but it solved them at a cost that nobody had fully reckoned yet. Here's where the story turns, and it turns hard. Even before the first TriStar carried a single paying passenger, the airplane was already fighting for its life. Not because of anything wrong with the airframe itself. Lockheed's engineers had built something genuinely extraordinary. The fly-by-wire controls, the auto-land capability, the cabin acoustics, the lower galley system, all of it worked. The TriStar was, by the honest assessment of most people who examined it, the most technologically advanced commercial aircraft of its generation. The trouble was the engine. The Rolls-Royce RB211 was supposed to be a revolution. Not just a new engine, but a new kind of engine. A high-bypass turbofan that would be lighter, more powerful, more fuel-efficient, and dramatically quieter than anything else in the widebody market. Rolls-Royce had bet the company on several ambitious technologies simultaneously. Chief among them, fan blades made from carbon fibre rather than metal. The carbon fibre blades would be lighter, which meant less weight, which meant less fuel burned, which meant better economics for every airline that flew the engine. On paper, it was a brilliant idea. In practice, it was a catastrophe. The carbon fibre blades couldn't survive bird strikes. A single bird ingested during takeoff could shatter a blade, and a shattered blade at 40,000 revolutions per minute could destroy the engine and everything around it. Rolls-Royce tried fix after fix, modification after modification, but the material simply wasn't ready for the job. Eventually, the company abandoned carbon fibre and redesigned the fan blades in titanium, heavier, costlier, but strong enough to survive what the real world would throw at them. That redesign ate time. It ate money. And it ate Rolls-Royce alive. Development costs spiraled past every estimate the company had made. Technical setbacks multiplied. Deadlines passed and were reset and passed again. And in February of 1971, more than a full year before the TriStar was scheduled for FAA certification, Rolls-Royce declared bankruptcy. Let that settle for a moment. The sole engine manufacturer for Lockheed's brand new widebody airliner, an airplane already ordered by Eastern, TWA, Delta, Air Canada, and half a dozen other carriers around the world, simply ceased to exist as a going concern. Not wobbled, not teetered, went bankrupt. The British government moved quickly to nationalise what remained of Rolls-Royce and keep the RB211 programme alive, because the alternative was an industrial collapse that would ripple through the British aerospace sector and beyond. But the damage to Lockheed's programme was profound and immediate. The TriStar was delayed by roughly 2 years. Orders stalled. Airlines that had committed to the L-1011 were left waiting, some of them shifting their attention and their money to the DC-10, which used the General Electric CF6 engine and suffered no comparable delay. 2 years. In commercial aviation, 2 years is an eternity. 2 years is the difference between being first to market and being an afterthought. And Lockheed itself wasn't in much better shape than its engine supplier. The company had been hemorrhaging money on military contracts. The C-5A Galaxy transport program alone had generated losses so staggering that they shocked even Pentagon budget analysts. The TriStar program desperately needed financing that Lockheed could no longer secure on its own through normal commercial channels. What followed was one of the more remarkable and contentious episodes in American corporate history. Lockheed went to the United States Congress and asked for help. Not a bailout in the strict sense. What Lockheed sought was a federal loan guarantee of up to $250 million. A government promise to stand behind Lockheed's commercial borrowing so that banks would continue to extend credit. The debate was fierce. Critics called it corporate welfare, a dangerous precedent, a reward for mismanagement. Supporters argued that letting Lockheed fail would destroy tens of thousands of skilled jobs, gut the defence industrial base, and hand the domestic widebody market to McDonnell Douglas without a fight. The Emergency Loan Guarantee Act passed the United States Senate by a single vote. One vote. One senator deciding yes instead of no, and the airplane with the hidden kitchen lived. One senator changing his mind the other way, and the TriStar, the whisper liner, the living rooms that fly, the quiet cabin and the buried galley, and every last roll of that 19-foot carpet would have been engineering drawings in a filing cabinet, nothing more. Now think about what this means for the story we're telling. Every element of the TriStar that we've described, the lower deck galley, the 2 small lifts, the pneumatic headphones, the high ceiling, the sound insulation, the 7 stereo channels, the wall-to-wall carpet, all of it was conceived during a period of supreme confidence. Lockheed believed deeply and sincerely that commercial airlines would pay a premium for refinement, that passengers would choose an airplane the way they'd choose a good hotel, by how it made them feel, by how it treated them, by whether the experience rose to the level of something worth remembering. The galley went below deck because Lockheed was certain that the serenity of the passenger cabin was worth every dollar of engineering complexity and every cubic foot of cargo space the kitchen consumed. That certainty shaped the airplane at the deepest level of its architecture. The hidden galley wasn't an add-on or an option. It was a foundational design decision, made years before the first rivet was driven, because Lockheed believed the world wanted an airplane that put human comfort ahead of logistical convenience. But by the time the TriStar actually entered revenue service in April of 1972, the confidence that had shaped its design was already running headlong into a decade that would punish confidence at every turn. Give Lockheed this much. When the airplane finally reached passengers, it delivered. Easton's Whisperliner service drew genuine admiration from travellers and aviation writers alike. The cabin was everything the brochures had promised: quiet, spacious, composed. The ride was smooth in a way that passengers noticed and commented on. The food arrived at the right temperature. The aisles stayed clear. TWA's first-class diners swiveled their seats, unfolded their tables, and ate meals that had risen silently from a kitchen beneath their shoes. Delta's living rooms that fly earned the phrase honestly: flight after flight, city after city, coast to coast. Passengers noticed the difference. Not all of them could name the airplane. Most travellers then, as now, had only a vague sense of what type they were flying and couldn't tell a TriStar from a DC-10 if you'd shown them photographs at the gate. But they noticed the feeling, the calm, the composure, the peculiar sense that this particular flight was more pleasant, more spacious, more considered than what they were accustomed to. Something was different, and even if they couldn't quite name what it was, they felt it. But outside the cabin windows, the economics of aviation were changing fast, and the change, when it came, was brutal. In October of 1973, and just 18 months after the TriStar entered commercial service, the Arab oil embargo struck. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries cut production and imposed restrictions on exports to nations that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, and fuel prices didn't creep upward, they quadrupled. Almost overnight, the cost of jet fuel, the single largest operating expense for any airline, exploded, and suddenly every carrier in the world was looking at its fleet with different eyes. Not how comfortable is this airplane? Not how do passengers feel about the cabin? The questions now were sharper, colder, and stripped of sentiment. How much does this airplane cost to fly per hour? How much revenue does it generate per available seat mile? What does it earn, and what does it waste? The TriStar was a fine airplane by almost every engineering measure. Quiet, smooth, mechanically reliable once the RB211 found its stride. Passengers loved it. Pilots respected its handling and its advanced systems. But it was also an airplane that had traded valuable lower-deck cargo space for a hidden kitchen. Every square foot devoted to ovens, warming compartments, refrigeration units, prep counters, cart storage, and lift machinery was a square foot that couldn't hold freight containers. And freight, in the harsh new economics of the 1970s, was becoming a financial lifeline. Airlines that could fill their cargo holds, the bellies of their widebodies, with commercial freight alongside their cabins, with passengers, had a measurable, quantifiable advantage on every route they flew. A 747 or a DC-10 carrying a full passenger load and a full belly of cargo earned revenue from two sources simultaneously. The same airplane with a full cabin and an empty hold earned considerably less. Airlines operating TriStars with lower-deck galleys were paying for elegance twice. Once in the direct cost of the galley system, the lifts, the ovens, the dedicated service door that Air Canada had requested Lockheed to add for faster ground handling and turnaround. And again, in the cargo revenue, they couldn't earn because the space was occupied by kitchen equipment instead of freight containers. On transcontinental routes, transatlantic services, anywhere with a healthy cargo market, the TriStar was leaving money on the tarmac every time it pushed back from the gate. And not everyone aboard the TriStar was enchanted by the hidden galley either. The flight attendants, the people who actually worked in the lower kitchen, who loaded the carts and timed the lifts and rode the elevators up and down during service, had a more complicated relationship with the arrangement than the passengers ever knew. The layout was efficient, yes. Lockheed had thought carefully about workflow and ergonomics, but working below deck meant isolation. Real, tangible, felt in the bones isolation. You were down there for 20, 30, 40 minutes at a stretch during a full meal service, away from the passengers, away from your colleagues on the main deck, tucked into a windowless room with no natural light and no view of anything at all except stainless steel and meal trays and the blank face of the lift door. Contemporary accounts confirm what common sense suggests. Flight attendants often disliked being stuck below the floor during service. The lower deck galleys were generally more practical than the lower load passenger lounges some airlines had experimented with on other widebodies, but that was a low bar. The work was physical, the space was warm, and the feeling of being underground, or under cabin more precisely. While the airplane flew and the passengers ate, and the cabin above carried on as if nothing were happening downstairs. That was a kind of professional loneliness that no amount of clever engineering could entirely solve. The dream of effortless elegance, it turned out, required someone to perform the effort in a place specifically designed so that no one would notice them doing it. And that tension between the serene cabin above and the hidden labour below, between the passenger's experience of quiet composure and the crew members' experience of warm, windowless, isolated work, is the deepest truth of this airplane's story. What looked effortless upstairs was expensive downstairs, and every square foot below deck had another possible use. By the mid-1970s, the TriStar found itself caught between admiration and arithmetic. And in commercial aviation, arithmetic always wins eventually. The airplane continued to impress everyone who flew it. Pilots appreciated the advanced flight control systems. The TriStar was the first widebody to offer direct lift control, a technology that smoothed approaches and made landings remarkably gentle. Passengers kept remarking on the quiet. Airlines that operated the type built loyal followings around the cabin experience. Air Canada's input had even improved the airplane's ground operations. That dedicated galley service door Lockheed added at their request made catering and turnaround measurably faster. The TriStar was not a failure of engineering. It was a masterwork of engineering that had the terrible misfortune of arriving at precisely the wrong moment in history. Because the pressure kept building, fuel costs stayed stubbornly high long after the initial shock of the embargo faded. The RB211 delays had handed a 2-year head start to the DC-10, a direct competitor that was less refined in the cabin. No hidden galley, no whisperliner quiet, no lower deck magic, but simpler to operate, easier to maintain, and friendlier to the balance sheet. McDonnell Douglas had eaten deeply into Lockheed's potential order book during those lost years, and many of those orders would never come back. Then came the blow that changed everything, not just for the TriStar, but for the entire American airline industry. In 1978, President Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act into law. It dismantled the system of government-controlled routes and fares that had governed American commercial aviation since the 1930s. Under the old regime, the Civil Aeronautics Board decided which airlines could fly which routes and what they could charge for tickets. Competition happened on service, not on price, because the price was fixed. You couldn't undercut your rival's fare, so you outclassed their cabin instead. Better food, better seats, more attentive service, a nicer airplane. The TriStar's hidden galley made perfect sense in that world. It was an architectural expression of a business philosophy that only worked when airlines competed on quality rather than cost. Passenger comfort is worth investing in, even if it means complexity, even if it means lost cargo revenue, even if it means flight attendants working in a windowless kitchen below the floor. Deregulation gutted that philosophy. Suddenly, airlines could compete on price. Suddenly, new carriers could enter any market without government permission. Suddenly, every dollar of operating cost mattered. Every pound of cargo capacity mattered. Every square foot of the airplane needed to justify itself not in passenger satisfaction surveys, but in revenue per available seat mile. The hidden kitchen wasn't just a clever luxury anymore. It had become a question, and the question was as blunt as the decade that was asking it. Was the serenity of a clutter-free cabin worth the revenue of a full cargo hold? Soon the airplane itself would answer. Let's go back below deck one last time. Not to admire the engineering, we've done that. Not to marvel at the layout or the cleverness of the lifts. This time, come down here during a full dinner service on a coast-to-coast flight. Come down here to work. It's early evening. The seatbelt sign has been off for an hour. 250 passengers are settled in upstairs, reading, dozing, listening to Channel 3 through their headphones, watching the sky darken through oval windows. The cabin is composed. The aisles are empty. Everything above the floor looks exactly the way Lockheed intended it to look. Quiet, spacious, unhurried. Below the floor, the galley is a different country. 3 flight attendants are working the lower kitchen. The ovens have been running for 20 minutes and the heat is tangible, not oppressive, not dangerous, but present in a way that you feel on your forearms and the back of your neck. It's a dry heat, the kind that commercial ovens produce, and it builds as the service progresses because the warming compartments are open and the food is cycling through in volume. 250 meals don't warm themselves quietly. They radiate. The ventilation fans are running. They help. But a galley is a galley. Even a well-designed one generates warmth, steam, and the accumulated smell of dozens of entrees, restoring simultaneously. Down here, the air carries a layered scent. Stainless steel, hot aluminum, the faintly chemical edge of foil packaging. And beneath all of that, the actual food, bread rolls crisping, chicken in sauce, something with rosemary. Coffee heating in industrial urns large enough to serve an entire cabin section in one pass. The trays come out of the warming compartments in sequence. First-class meals first. Fewer trays, more elaborate presentations, each one given a visual check before it goes onto the cart. The garnish is in place. The entree is centered. The dessert is positioned correctly in its small compartment. Then the forward coach trays, simpler presentations, higher volume, loaded into the cart slots with practiced speed. Then the rear coach section, the largest batch, the longest loading sequence, the one that generates the most sustained heat and the most physical work. Each cart, once loaded, rolls to one of the 2 lifts. The lift door opens, a metal panel that slides aside with a sound somewhere between a click and a thud. The cart slides in on its rails. The door closes. And with a mechanical whir, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably industrial, a sound no passenger above will ever associate with their dinner, the cart rises through the shaft and disappears. Upstairs, a flight attendant is waiting at the service point near the lift opening. The cart arrives with a soft stop. She takes the handle, wheels it into position, and walks it forward into the cabin. Passengers see her appear with the food. They don't see the shaft in the floor, or if they do, they don't think about it. They certainly don't think about what's happening on the other side of that panel. Because down below, the lift is already descending. Empty. And the next cart, the one for the forward coach section, is already positioned at the door, loaded and waiting. Cart loaded, lift sent, lift returned. Cart loaded, lift sent. The rhythm repeats, and it has to stay on pace, because the first-class passengers upstairs are already eating, and the coach passengers are expecting their meals within minutes. And a 40-minute gap between first class and the last row of coach is the kind of timing failure that generates complaints. The 3 crew members below manage this rhythm in a space with no natural light, no windows, no view of the cabin, no visual sense of where they are in the flight, or what the passengers are doing, or whether anyone upstairs has noticed that the food is arriving on schedule. They know the time by the clock on the galley wall and the state of the ovens. They know the progress of the service by how many carts have gone up and how many are left. They communicate with the main deck crew by intercom, brief exchanges, functional rather than conversational. First class cart is up. Copy, sending coach forward. The language of coordination, not connection. Flight attendants who worked these lower galleys remembered the experience with a clarity that suggests it stayed with them. Not all of those memories were warm. The workflow was sound. Lockheed's engineers had done their job well, and the galley moved efficiently when the timing held and the equipment cooperated. But the isolation was real, and it was persistent. 30 minutes below deck during a full dinner service. Sometimes longer, if a cart jammed or an oven cycled slowly, or a lift needed a second attempt. 30 minutes in a windowless room, separated from your colleagues on the main deck, separated from the passengers you were feeding, doing the most physically demanding work of the flight, in a space that existed precisely because it was meant to be unseen. Some crew members adapted to it easily. It was the job. You went downstairs, you worked the service, you came back up. Others found it genuinely uncomfortable, not because the galley was dangerous or poorly designed, but because of what it felt like to be underground while the airplane flew. The sense of being below everything and everyone. The awareness that your labour was producing an experience, a calm, pleasant, effortless-seeming meal service that depended entirely on your willingness to do that labour in a place where no one would see you doing it. The arrangement's central bargain was invisibility. The hidden kitchen only worked if it stayed hidden. The elegance of the cabin above, those clear aisles that composed atmosphere, the food appearing as if by gentle magic, depended on the work below being out of sight, out of earshot, and entirely out of the passenger's conscious mind. And there's something in that worth pausing on, not to judge it, not to call it exploitation or injustice. It was a job, and the people who did it were professionals, but to notice it. To notice that the most celebrated feature of this airplane, the feature that made the TriStar's cabin feel unlike any other commercial aircraft in the sky, existed because of labour that was deliberately made invisible. The passengers experienced the result. The crew produced the result. And the distance between those two experiences was no more than a few feet of cabin floor, but it might as well have been a world. The galley wasn't the only thing competing for space in the TriStar's belly. And this is where the economics stop being abstract and start being decisive. The lower deck of a wide-body jet is prime real estate, some of the most valuable cubic footage in commercial aviation. On the 747, on the DC-10, on virtually every other wide-body of this era, the space beneath the passenger cabin is divided between forward baggage holds and rear freight compartments. Passenger bags go in one section. Commercial cargo, boxes, crates, standardized containers called unit load devices, fills the other. And that cargo earns money, serious money. Airlines in the 1970s had discovered what logistics companies had known for decades. If you're flying a route anyway, every pound of freight you carry in the belly is essentially found revenue. The airplane is going from New York to Los Angeles regardless. The fuel is burned regardless. The crew is paid regardless. But if you can fill the lower hold with commercial cargo, electronics, machine parts, medical supplies, documents, anything that someone will pay to move quickly across the country, you earn revenue on top of the passenger tickets at a marginal cost that approaches zero. By the mid-70s, belly cargo had become critical to airline economics. The fuel crisis had compressed passenger margins to the bone. Fares were rising, but so were costs, and the gap between revenue and expense on many routes was dangerously thin. Airlines that could generate robust cargo income alongside their passenger business had a buffer. Airlines that couldn't were exposed. The TriStar's lower-deck galley occupied space that, on any competing widebody, would hold cargo containers. Lockheed had made this trade-off consciously when they laid out the airplane in the late 60s, betting that the passenger experience, the clear aisles, the quiet cabin, the living room atmosphere, would be worth more to the airlines than the freight revenue. In a regulated market, where ticket prices were fixed by the government and airlines differentiated themselves on service quality, that bet had a certain elegant logic. By the late 70s, the logic had collapsed. Airlines could now compete on price. New carriers could enter any route, and every cubic foot of lower-deck space devoted to ovens, warming compartments, refrigeration equipment, cart storage, lift shafts and galley infrastructure was a cubic foot that couldn't earn cargo revenue. The numbers were not abstract. They showed up in quarterly reports, in route profitability analyses, in the hard arithmetic that airline planners stared at every morning over cold coffee. The TriStar, with its lower galley installed, carried measurably less cargo than its direct competitors on routes where freight demand was strong. On a busy transcontinental corridor, the difference could amount to thousands of dollars per flight. Multiplied across hundreds of flights per year, the lost cargo revenue became a figure that no airline could pretend didn't matter. The hidden kitchen had been an architectural bet that passenger serenity was worth paying for in space and complexity. The bet was losing, and Lockheed knew it. Somewhere in the engineering offices in Burbank, California, designers were already working on a new version of the TriStar, one that would keep the name, keep the three-engine layout, keep the Rolls-Royce power, but would answer the question the original airplane had been avoiding since the day it was drawn. The L-1011-50 arrived in the late 1970s, and from a distance it looked like a modest evolution, a family resemblance with a few proportional adjustments. If you weren't paying close attention, you might have mistaken it for the original, but you'd have been wrong. The -500 was a substantially different airplane, redesigned from the inside out for a different mission and a different era. The fuselage was shorter. Lockheed trimmed it to reduce structural weight and improve the airplane's lift-to-drag ratio, trading passenger capacity for performance. The wings were modified, slightly extended, with active ailerons at the tips that improved efficiency in cruise. The engines were upgraded to more powerful variants of the RB211, and the fuel system was expanded to carry significantly more kerosene in the center section tanks and in an additional tank in the tail. The result was an airplane that could fly routes the standard TriStar couldn't reach without refueling. London to the Gulf states, Europe to South America, the long ocean crossings that the original L-1011-1 had never been designed for. On paper, the -500 was the TriStar coming of age, growing from a domestic widebody into an intercontinental aircraft, a natural next step for a platform that had always had potential beyond the American trunk routes. But the change that mattered most, the change that answers the question this documentary has been asking since the first 5 minutes, had nothing to do with range or wingspan or fuel capacity. The -500 moved the galley back upstairs. Let that sit for a moment. Because everything the TriStar had stood for, the hidden kitchen, the quiet cabin, the clear aisles, the living room that flew with its food operation buried silently beneath the floor, was contained in the decision to put the galley below deck. That decision was the TriStar's soul. It was the thing that made the airplane feel different from every other widebody in the sky. It was the feature that brochures celebrated, that passengers remembered without knowing what they were remembering, that flight attendants worked inside during every meal service on every route, and the -500 reversed it. No more lower deck kitchen. No more lifts cycling carts up through the floor. No more flight attendants descending to a windowless room to produce the quiet magic that the cabin depended on. The galley returned to the main passenger deck, installed in the standard positions forward and aft, visible, accessible, occupying cabin space rather than cargo space. The carts were back in the aisles. The ovens were back beside the passengers, and the belly of the -500 was given back, completely and without reservation, to baggage and freight. Lockheed presented this change as a practical optimization. The -500 was designed for international operations. It needed range, and range meant fuel, and fuel was heavy, and every pound mattered. It needed cargo capacity because international routes carried high-value freight, and because airlines operating long-haul services depended on belly cargo to make marginal routes profitable. Moving the galley upstairs freed the entire lower deck for revenue-generating cargo. It was efficient. It was sensible. It was what the market demanded. And all of that was true, every word of it. But it was also an admission, not spoken in a press conference or printed in a brochure, but written into the structure of the airplane itself, as clearly as if someone had carved it into the fuselage. The hidden galley was too expensive to keep. Not expensive merely in dollars, though the lift system was mechanically complex, and the dedicated galley service door added cost. Not expensive merely in maintenance hours, though the lower deck kitchen required upkeep that a standard galley did not. Expensive in space. Expensive in cargo revenue surrendered on every flight for the privilege of a calm cabin. Expensive in the hidden, invisible labour of crew members working in isolation below the floor so that the passengers above could enjoy the illusion of effortless service. Expensive in the opportunity cost of an idea that belonged to a regulated era of protected routes and fixed fares, an era that was already over. The -500 kept the TriStar's name, its silhouette against the sky, its 3 Rolls-Royce engines, its reputation as a quiet, smooth, well-mannered airplane. But it surrendered the feature that had given the original TriStar its singular character. The kitchen came home. It moved back upstairs, back into the cabin, back into the passenger's field of view. The magic trick was over. And the idea that a commercial jetliner could hide its entire food service operation beneath the floor, that an airline would spend that kind of engineering ingenuity, that much physical real estate, and that much human effort just so the cabin could feel composed and serene and effortlessly calm, simply ended. Not with a crash, not with a headline, not with a dramatic last flight, just a decision. A drawing changed, a specification revised, and the kitchen went back where kitchens had always been. If you're looking for the precise moment when commercial aviation stopped trying to feel like a living room and started trying to feel like a balance sheet, when the industry chose cargo over calm, efficiency over elegance, the spreadsheet over the passenger's quiet sense of wonder. This is as clean and honest a marker as you will find anywhere in the history of flight. The TriStar didn't disappear after that, not by a long way. Delta Airlines, the type's most devoted operator, continued flying L-1011s for years, decades in fact. Delta's TriStar fleet remained in revenue service from 1973 all the way to 2001. An extraordinary 28-year run that saw the airplane carry millions of passengers across the American domestic network. Those TriStars flew the big trunk routes, Atlanta to Los Angeles, Dallas to New York, Chicago to Miami, and they did it with a reliability and a cabin presence that earned genuine, lasting affection. Pilots liked flying them. Flight attendants developed a fondness for the type that outlasted the airplane itself. And passengers, even in later years when the TriStar was aging and newer aircraft were entering the fleet, noticed something about the cabin that they couldn't quite articulate. A roominess, a quiet, a sense that this airplane had been designed by people who cared about the experience of sitting in it. Other carriers kept their TriStars in service well into the 80s and 90s too. The type found new lives around the world, with Gulf Air, with Saudia, with operators in South Asia and the Middle East who valued the wide cabin, the smooth ride, and the relative fuel efficiency of the three-engine layout on medium to long-range routes. Charter airlines in Europe flew TriStars on holiday services to the Mediterranean, packed with vacationers who had no idea they were travelling aboard one of the most technologically sophisticated airframes of the 1970s. A few L-1011s ended their working lives as pure freighters. Their passenger cabins were stripped out entirely, the carpet pulled up, the seats removed, the overhead bins and reading lights and pneumatic headphone jacks all taken away. The fuselage was fitted with a cargo door, the interior lined with roller floors and restraint systems, and the airplane, that had once hidden a kitchen to preserve the elegance of a living room, spent its final years carrying nothing but pallets and shipping containers. No passengers, no meals, no hidden galley or visible one, just cargo end to end in a tube that had been designed to make human beings feel comfortable and was now being used to move boxes. There's a quiet, wistful irony in that, not a bitter one, just the kind that comes from watching something beautiful find a practical ending. But among the passengers and crew who flew the early TriStar, the standard body L-1011-1 with the lower deck galley, the twin lifts, the hidden kitchen working beneath the floor, the memory held. Passengers who travelled on those airplanes in the early and middle 1970s remembered them with a specificity that surprises even aviation historians. Not by model number. Most travellers then, as now, couldn't have identified an L-1011 by name, any more than they could have identified the exact model of car they'd rented at the airport. But they remembered by sensation. By feeling. They remembered the quiet, a quiet so noticeable that it became the thing they mentioned first when they talked about the flight. They remembered the spaciousness, 2 wide aisles, room to move, room to breathe, a cabin that felt designed rather than merely assembled. They remembered meals that appeared without fuss, without the clatter and obstruction of heavy carts blocking the aisles, without the industrial clamour that they'd come to associate with airline food service on other airplanes. They remembered a calm that they couldn't explain. And they were remembering, without knowing it, the work of a kitchen they'd never seen. A kitchen beneath their feet. A kitchen built below the floor of a jet airliner by an aerospace company that believed the way a cabin felt was worth engineering for. A kitchen that no longer exists on any commercial airplane flying anywhere in the world. There's one image from this story that stays. A meal cart, loaded and warm, rising through a small lift in the floor of a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar. It arrives at the cabin level with a soft mechanical stop, a click, a slight settling of weight on rails, and a flight attendant takes the handle, wheels it forward and begins to serve. The passengers don't look down. They don't wonder where the food appeared from. They don't know that 3 of their fellow crew members are standing beneath them in a windowless galley, already loading the next cart. The aisle is clear. The cabin is hushed. The carpet is soft underfoot, 19 feet of it wall to wall. Through the headphones, something gentle is playing on Channel 4, and everything feels, for this moment, exactly as it should, composed, unhurried, considered, as if someone, somewhere, had thought very carefully about what it would be like to sit in this seat, on this airplane, at this altitude, and had decided that the experience ought to be good. For a brief window in the 1970s, a handful of airlines chose to bury an entire working kitchen beneath the passenger floor of a commercial jetliner. They spent millions of dollars on it. They gave up cargo revenue for it. They asked their flight attendants to work in a windowless room beneath the cabin for it. And they did all of this for an idea that most passengers would never consciously notice, because the whole point was that you weren't supposed to notice. You were supposed to sit in a cabin that felt like a living room, eat a meal that arrived at precisely the right temperature, look down an aisle that was clear and open and calm, and never once wonder how any of it was possible. That kind of care doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for applause. It simply makes the space around you feel a little more considered, a little more composed, a little more like someone gave a damn about what it was like to be you, sitting there 35,000 feet above the earth with somewhere to go. It doesn't come around often, that kind of care. And when it does, it never lasts as long as it should. But for a few years, in the belly of an airplane that the world nearly lost, before it carried a single passenger, a hidden kitchen worked in silence so that a living room could fly. And that is worth remembering.